in the chat. So feel free to open it up or print it out. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So we're sharing where we're from, how long we've been gardening, things we like to grow. We went over the handout. It has some notes. I'll point out during the presentation when there's things that are on the handout, so you don't have to worry that you have to take notes, and you can just relax. So throughout the class, if there's some questions that come up for you, you can put them in the chat. I have some points during the class where I stop and ask and answer questions. So feel free, if something comes up, stick it in the chat and I'll try to get to it. And then anything we don't get to, we can do at the end of the class. So if people want to stick around, Liz said she's not in a big rush. So if we go over a little bit, that's fine with some questions. All right. So I'm curious, how many months of the year are you harvesting food from your garden? So put it in chat. Usually I have people to just yell out during the class when we do it live. So share with me, how many months do you get? So we have 3, we have 4. Somebody said 2. What else? 4 to 5, 6 to 7, 5. So a pretty wide range. So this is me in my garden last December, and I'm harvesting some kale right after we got a big snowstorm. It started to get pretty cold at this point last December. And I usually harvest from my garden somewhere, usually March through December. So most of the time, the only 2 months that I'm not harvesting from my garden are January and February. And I don't have a greenhouse. I do have a couple little tricks up my sleeve. And I live in Madison, which is in zone 5, so it's a very cold area. But I still manage to harvest for about 10 months of the year. So we're going to talk about some tricks and some suggestions that I've learned over the years to help you be getting more food from your garden. So I think a lot of people think if you live in Wisconsin, if you live in another cold weather area, oh, you can only really get food for June, July, and August, or July, August, September. And that is not true. You should be getting food for at least 6 months, and you could go all the way up to 10 months. So I'm going to give you some tricks tonight that'll help you do that. So here's a couple examples of different things I harvest different months of the year. So this is the only time I have ever harvested in February, which I believe was 2017 when we had a really warm winter. But I'm harvesting spinach February 27th, the only time in the 17 years I've lived and gardened in Madison I've ever harvested in February. So it was really exciting. Usually I'm harvesting in March. Spinach. So not often in February, but usually in March. And I'm going to teach you how to do that in this class. So it's March now, so I'm expecting that I will be able to start harvesting in my garden by mid to late March. It's pretty cold still, and we still have snow on the ground in Madison, so it might not happen until more towards the end of the month. And then April 21st, which in Madison is the date around when most people are starting to plant in their gardens, I am already getting my first harvest. So this is on a typical year. So I'm harvesting just the beginning of a new planted spinach. I have salad mix. It looks like I have arugula, and I have some mizuna, and I have some scallions. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that. And then after April, many of us are harvesting in May, June, July, August, September, even October, depending on when you get your frost. This is what my garden looked like at the end of October last year. I still had a lot of food. I was giving a lot of food away to friends and neighbors. I take a weekly walk with a friend, and I would always bring her food. And she said, "I can't believe you still have so much food in your garden." And so I'm still harvesting a lot of stuff at the end of October. And then this is last year, November, let's see that it's covered up. November 11th, this was my harvest. I have turnips, radishes, carrots, more daikon radishes, kale, spinach, mustard, and arugula. So pretty big harvest for November 11th. This was another year, a few years ago, my Thanksgiving harvest. I was going to my in-laws and I packed all this in the cooler for Thanksgiving dinner. So I have some spinach and salad mix, Brussels sprouts, beets, carrots, turnips, another Japanese turnip, cilantro, and kale. And then December, I'm often harvesting carrots. So we're going to talk about that as well later in this class, often after it snows. I always joke that my neighbors probably drive by and look at me and think, what is she doing in her garden in the snow? So I think it's fun to try to cheat the season. And then this past December, before we got snow, we had a fairly mild fall. And this was my big harvest. I have various cold hardy greens like tatsoi and arugula and spinach, radishes, black radishes, daikon radishes, a whole bunch of cilantro, some broccoli rabe, which was the first time I ever grew that last year, turnips, and then some more daikon radishes. So December 8th, this was towards the last time I really harvested in my garden. So I've been taking a break since then. And then sometime between the 8th and the 11th, we got snow. And then here's me peeking in my cold frame. I still have a lot of things that I can harvest that are still nice and green. So actually I probably harvested once more after that, which it's always fun to go out and open the cold frame and see lots of beautiful green vegetables to harvest. And then, so this is what my garden often looks like heading into fall. And so some of the ways that I do this are using low tunnels, which is this plastic contraption right here, row cover, and cold frames. So we're not really going to talk about those three things in this class. I just want to give you a little taste of what you can accomplish with those things. I have another class where I really talk about extending the harvest into the fall and into the early winter, and then again into the really early spring. But in this class, I really wanted to talk about things that you can do to get food for more months of the year without having to build a low tunnel or a cold frame or use row cover. Those are kind of things that once you start to institute some of the things you learn in this class, then you can take it to another level if you're really enjoying it and really push the season even further. So my business is The Creative Vegetable Gardener, and my mission tonight is to inspire you to try new things and have more fun in your garden. I think for many of us who garden for many years, we can get stuck in a rut and do the same things over and over again, plant the same varieties. I don't know, sometimes you just keep doing the same things over and over in life and in gardening. So I'm gonna try to pop you out of that and get you excited to try some new things tonight. All right, so I'll just give you a little tour of my garden because I know gardeners love to see other people's gardens. I live in Madison in the city. This is a picture of my front yard garden. My house is on a corner, and so it's very visible. We have a lot of walkers and bikers and a little bit of car traffic. And I have a perennial garden between the street and then my vegetable garden on the other side. So street, perennial garden, vegetable garden on this side. There's another picture. I have some raised beds, 3 different styles of raised beds, which I talk about in one of my other classes. That looks like it's more in August. There's lots of flowers. I like to have a really beautiful and productive garden. And then my garden also wraps around to the side of my house. This is the south side. Again, we're on a corner, so we're right up against the street. I do have a backyard, but it's really shady, so I don't have a garden back there. And so it's really fun. I've actually become a huge proponent of front yard gardens. I've met tons of people in my neighborhood. We know a lot of people that live around us because my husband likes to work in the yard as well, and I'm often in the vegetable garden. People stop by, pull their cars over, tell me that they tell their family members to walk down the street, that they often walk down the street because they always want to find out what's going on in the garden. So especially last year with COVID, it felt really meaningful and special to have a garden that was so front and center to my neighborhood because people were out and about a lot, and we got a lot of compliments and a lot of people thanking us for spending a lot of time and energy on our yards so that they could enjoy it. So it kind of feels like a neighborhood service sometimes. I'm not just gardening for myself, but I'm also gardening for my neighbors and the people that live around me. Couple more photos. This looks like it's heading into fall. All right, so why might you want to feed your garden to feed you all year? So you can save money. So let's see, it's March. I am still eating a lot of things from last year's garden. For example, tonight we had roasted vegetables with an herb sauce. So I made the herb sauce in the summer, froze it, and then I still have onions and garlic from my garden that we used in the roasted veggies. Sometimes I still have beets and carrots. I don't have those this time of year. We bought some from the farmer's market. But onions and garlic and lots of different sauces we're eating from last year's garden. So it's a great way to save money. In the winter, sometimes produce is at its most expensive in the winter because things are coming from far away. I also find that things don't always taste that great because they're coming from far away, and they're often picked when they're underripe. So it's a great way to save money in the winter when grocery costs are high. And then higher quality. I think a tomato is a great example that there's no tomato that you could ever buy from the store that tastes as good as one you would harvest out of your garden. So when you are eating more food for more months of the year from your garden, you're eating higher quality food that tastes a lot better than the things that you get in the grocery store. I think once you start growing your own food, you get really spoiled and you learn how things are really supposed to taste as opposed to how they taste when you buy them from the grocery store. And then you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor longer. So gardening can be a lot of work. It's joyful work for sure, but it still takes time and effort and money. And I don't find that it really takes much more time or effort to extend my harvests into more months of the year. So it's just maybe a little bit more work and a little bit more planning, and then I get a lot more food. And then you get to garden for more months of the year. This might not be something that everybody wants to do, but I love gardening, and I think it's actually really fun to be out in the fall and the early winter in my garden, not for long amounts of time, but certainly here and there and harvesting. And I always feel like I'm cheating the season. And I figured some special secret out when I'm harvesting something in the snow. So this is a picture of me a few years ago after a snowstorm, and I'm cutting down some Brussels sprout plants to bring in and roast for dinner. All right, so our first step is to strategically decide what to grow. So this is when you kind of take a step backwards, like the bird's eye view. And this is a great time to think about that because it's before we've really started planting in our gardens. So we're still in the planning phase. And you're going to look at your eating and your grocery shopping and your cooking habits. So these questions are on your handout. And usually in a live class, I give people time to answer them. But in a virtual class, we'll just keep going because it's sometimes a little strange to have dead time. But these questions are on the handout, and you want to focus on foods you can grow. So you want to think about what produce do you spend the most money on throughout the year? Focusing on foods you can grow. Maybe you spend a lot of money on avocados, but unless you live in California, you're not going to be able to grow avocados. So you want to focus on things that you know that you can grow, and even maybe things that you know you can grow a lot of. So which vegetables taste better when you eat them in season? That could be a way to prioritize what you want to grow more of, what you might want to preserve. Which vegetables would you eat more of if you had more access to them? And then what vegetables are easy to preserve for out of season use and eating? So I would encourage you after this class or sometime later this week to sit down and think about the answers to some of these questions and jot them down in a notebook or on the handout. And then you're going to use those answers to set your priorities. What are the things that are really a priority to grow? So why don't you type in the chat what came to mind from thinking about those questions? What's one of your priority vegetables to grow? Lost the chat. Let's see what people are saying. Tomatoes, kale, tomatoes. tomatoes, onions, red bell peppers, tomatoes, onion, garlic, carrots, radishes, peppers, onions, eggplant, spinach. We have a lot of tomatoes, onions, and kale. That's great because we're going to talk about some of those in this class. Lots of people said tomatoes. I know tomatoes are so great. Peppers, cucumbers, garlic. Somebody said squash. Almost everyone's saying tomatoes. Green beans, more cucumbers, peas, squash blossoms, sweet potatoes, spinach, greens. All right, those are great. So I'll share a couple of my priorities. One of mine is onions. I was saying as people were entering into the class, I have my seed starting rack right next to me, and I have 700 onions started. They're all up and growing underneath the lights, and I usually plant about 500 of them. And I'm still eating onions from last year. And I agree with the people that said red peppers, red, orange, yellow peppers, sweet peppers, and also like hot peppers are some of my priorities. Peppers in particular, make me feel really rich when I'm harvesting lots and lots of sweet, beautiful sweet peppers. I usually grow somewhere around 35 plants. So sometimes I have a huge basket full and I just think, oh, I'm so wealthy. Look at all these peppers I have. They always just seem so valuable, I think, because they're expensive at the grocery store. And then spinach, this is me with giant winter spinach. We're going to talk about spinach in this class. That's one of my priority vegetables. And then garlic, I usually plant about 220 garlic, and just like the onions, store them for winter eating. So this is a planting technique that I like to use this time of year, which is being strategic in what you grow. So you can answer the questions on the handout when you have a little bit more time. Make a list of your garden priorities and then consider whether you would want to grow more of them. So this might be a little bit more challenging if you have a small garden. I have a pretty big garden, and so there are several things that I grow a lot of. And I shared onions, garlic, I grow a lot of peppers, I grow as much spinach as possible, I grow a lot of kale, and those are kind of the things that are the foundation of my garden. I know that I'm going to grow a lot so that I have a lot throughout the year and also in the winter. And then I kind of fill in with lots of other vegetables, smaller amounts of other vegetables that aren't quite as big of a priority. And then you want to make sure there are vegetables from every season. And that's what we're going to get into in the rest of the class. So you're going to plan by season to grow more food. And we're going to go through each season of the year. So we'll start with spring because that's the one that's just about to begin, a couple weeks. So spring technique number 1 is to plant early. So this is one of the biggest things that you can do, even if you live in a cold weather area. I've heard so many gardeners in Wisconsin say that they don't start planting until Memorial Day weekend, and then they just plant their whole garden, and then they're done, and they never plant again for the rest of the season. So if you're in zone 5 like I am, and you wait until Memorial Day weekend to plant your whole garden, you are missing out on 6 weeks of the growing season. So I start planting in my garden about mid-April, depending on the weather. This is not in my cold frames in my low tunnels. This is just out in the garden without under cover. Sometimes I use row cover at that time of year, but nothing fancy, no cold frames or anything like that. So if you're wherever you live, you can start planting about 4 weeks before your last frost. So in Madison, it's usually around May 15th. Of course, it depends year to year. So let's just say it's May 15th. So I often start planting around April 15th. Depending on the weather, I usually look at the 10-day forecast. If there's snow or if it's going to be really cold, I might wait a few days. But in general, sometimes I start planting a little earlier if it's warm, and a little later if it's cold. So and I think one thing that people who wait to plant everything until after the average last frost, don't realize that there's a whole category of vegetables that are called frost tolerant vegetables that are fine if it gets cold. And in fact, they thrive in that weather. So you want to make sure you know what those whole cold hardy vegetables are. And these are on the handout, so you don't have to worry about copying them down. And look at that list. There are so many things that are frost hardy that you can start planting 4 weeks before your last frost. And if it gets down to 32 or a little below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, these are going to be fine. They don't mind a little bit of frost. And some of these things really do better, like cilantro, like lettuce mix, like spinach, in the cooler area, cooler time of year. If you wait to plant spinach unless you're in a really cold area, but if you're in a zone around zone 5 and you wait until 2 weeks after your last frost to start planting spinach, it's not going to do very well because it doesn't like the hot weather. So a lot of these things prefer the cooler weather of spring. So you want to plant before your average last frost. And I kind of consider this the early spring season. So there's a whole nother season in the garden that you can take advantage of where you're going to get more food if you start planting before your last frost. And as we said, there's a bonus. Many vegetables do better in cooler temperatures. Cilantro is a good example, although cilantro is also a victim of lengthening days, which is why it often bolts, but it does like the cooler temperatures. So here's an example of planting early. This must have been a somewhat warm year. I don't know which year this was, but I planted on April 11th, which is a little bit ahead of schedule. Must have been pretty warm. And then I harvested carrots on July 13th. This picture is from July 13th. So imagine if I had waited until Memorial Day weekend, 6 weeks later, to plant carrots, I wouldn't be harvesting them until almost September. So I'd have to wait till fall to eat carrots. And instead I pushed it up a little bit and I'm eating them a season earlier than I would be if I had waited to plant them. All right, so planting early. And a way that you can get yourself to plant early is to follow a planting calendar. So many, many years ago, I worked on a CSA farm and I realized, oh wow, farmers really plan everything out in the winter. And then the farmer that I worked with just had a big calendar. And so she would just say, okay, this week we're doing this. And I had my own garden as well. And I was working on the farm. And so I'd show up at the farm and I would say, okay, what are they doing this week? And I always realized like, oh, they're always ahead of me. They're doing all these things ahead of me. And I thought that's why they always have food. That's why they have food a lot more than I do. And so I started to realize, okay, I need some kind of calendar that just automatically starts to tell me what to do. So now I'm kind of accustomed 4 weeks before last frost, I need to check my calendar and start thinking about what are the things I can start planting. So this is a page from my Smart Start Garden Planner. And you can pick out your own last frost date and then fill in your own dates to customize it for your zone. So I would put my average last frost date is April 15th or May 15th. 4 weeks before my last frost is April 15th. And I can start planting all these things, and it's actually divided into direct seed and transplant. So you're either seeding directly into the ground or you're planting plants, which means you either have to buy the plants or you have to start seeds at home. So it kind of spells it all out for you. And 4 weeks before, you can start planting arugula and beets and carrots and cilantro and dill and peas and radishes and potatoes and all of these things. Not basil. This is a mistake. The first version of my book, my graphic designer messed up this thing and she put basil in there. And I was like, what? You can't tell people you cannot plant basil 4 weeks before last frost. It's extremely not frost hardy. So I should change that slide. That's an old picture. So, but the rest of it, it's all corrected now and it's all worked out. So if you have a copy of my book, you can print out the planting calendar. In the book, it gives you the website where you can print out a template if you want. You can print out that page in the book. If you're interested in the book, you can find it on my website. There's a digital copy and a print copy. But I also created a blog article that is about this planting schedule, which you can actually print out this planting schedule from the template from the blog post. So this is not on your handout, as you could just write down /planting-schedule. And then if you want to look that up later, it talks a lot about the planting schedule, how to figure out your average last frost if you don't know what that is, and has lots more information. But I highly, highly recommend having some kind of calendar that's personalized to your zone that you just follow year to year that keeps you going. And actually, well, okay, we'll get into that next. So for spring, which is our first season, so this is the things you can start to think about. It's being strategic in what you grow and possibly coming up with some garden priorities and things that you want to grow large amounts of. And then you're going to plant early. You're going to get out there before your average last frost, up to a month before that, and start paying attention to the weather and start planting. And then you want to follow a planting calendar, which is going to get you out there 4 weeks before your last frost. And then it's going to lead you, which we're going to talk about this as we talk about the summer. You're going to keep planting. You're going to start 4 weeks before your last frost, and then you're just going to keep planting. I plant all the way till September. All right, I'm going to check out the chat to see if any questions came up. If you have a tip that you'd like to share, a way that you get more food from your garden in the spring, feel free to put that in the chat because it's fun to hear what other people do in their gardens. Oh, thank you. Liz posted in the link to that blog post in the chat. Thank you, Liz. So somebody asked, am I planting seeds or plants? So hopefully I answered that question. I'm planting both seeds and plants. It really depends on the vegetable. Some things you direct seed and some things you transplant. So I think that was the only question. A couple of people said some of the priority vegetables are herbs because they're really costly. And when you buy them, you just need a little bit and they go to waste. I totally agree. I think herbs are one of the most worth it things to grow in your garden. All right. And then somebody asked if I grow onions from seed or starter bulbs, onion sets. I always grow from seed, but you have to start the seed. I already started my seeds. I have a great blog post. Maybe Liz can post that as well. I believe it's creativevegetablegardener.com / it's like growing onions. It's one of the most popular posts on my site. I break down all the different things you need to know to grow really great onions. I personally don't like growing from sets. I don't think they produce very good onions. So I always suggest either starting your own seeds or buying plants instead of sets. But you can read all about that in the blog post. All right, so if any other questions come up as I'm talking, feel free to put them in the chat and have a couple little prompts for myself to stop and look for questions. All right, so we're going to move on to early summer, which is kind of fun to think about right now as my garden is covered in snow. So this is my garden in early summer. I think this is actually last season. Looks so pretty. All right, so to pick up from the planting calendar, and we're planting early, I had said when I ended that section that not only you're planting early, but you're continuing to plant. And again, this might be a little bit more difficult if you have a really small garden, but if you have a medium or a large garden, you for sure should be practicing succession planting. And even with a small garden, you could probably squeeze in some succession planting. So I'm going to use carrots as an example. So here's some beautiful carrots in my garden. One of my favorite vegetable plants aesthetically. I just love those leaves. And here I am. Ooh, this year I'm planting on April 8th. So again, it must be really early, or it must be pretty warm on April 8th. And I'm planting carrot seeds. And these are white because sometimes I buy pelleted carrot seeds because I find them a lot easier to plant because carrot seeds are so tiny. These have just a clay covering that dissolves with water. So I planted on April 8th. And like that other picture, I'm harvesting July 16th. So carrots take about 3 months to grow. You can see I planted 4 different varieties, some purple varieties, a white variety, and kind of a little mini orange variety. And then this is similar to one of the other beds I showed you, I might have had some overwintered spinach, which we're going to talk about later, but something came out of this row on May 19th. So it's something from the previous season that was probably in my cold frame, probably bolted. I ripped it out and I planted a row of carrots. So that's one thing you can do. As soon as you have something that's not producing anymore, you rip it out and then you immediately replant. Sometimes I do that in the same day. I harvest onions and then the same day I'm replanting that bed in something else. I don't let things linger if they're not producing. And then on August 6th, I'm harvesting carrots from that same bed. So I planted them, oops, all right, May 19th and August 6th. The things are probably growing a little bit faster because we have long daylight, lots of light. August 6th, I'm harvesting. So that's my second succession planting and my second harvest. So I'm getting a longer harvest. So succession planting, which I didn't say when we started the section, is planting the same thing multiple times so that you get a continued harvest. So I'm planting carrots several times throughout the season, so I get a long harvest with lots of carrots because I really love carrots. And then July 11th, I'm planting probably my last succession. Sometimes I do 3, sometimes I do 4, but once you get to mid-July, it starts to get too late. They're not going to have time to mature because the days start getting shorter as we head into September and October. This is sometimes it's hard to get carrots to germinate if you're having a really hot and dry July, which sometimes we do in Madison. So I have tried all kinds of different things to try to get them to germinate. And this one's usually pretty successful, where I shade the soil and then they stay cool and more moist and they tend to germinate a little bit quicker. And then I'm harvesting on October 18th from that planting. So I started harvesting in July. I'm still harvesting in October. I usually harvest carrots in November. And then here's December, where it snowed. And I'm probably doing my last harvest of the season. I try to harvest before the ground freezes because they kind of turn to mush if you let them freeze. And so that's a lot of months. So that's July, August, September, October, November, December. Let's say a little over 5 months of harvest from 3 successions of carrots. So carrots are a great example of how you can plant multiple times throughout the season, because you can plant them from spring all the way through to summer, which is not true of every vegetable, but carrots are pretty forgiving, so they can grow in all kinds of weather. And a second example of succession planting would be this bed, where I have 2 rows. So these are green beans, and it's really easy, I'm sure you know, for those of you who grow green beans, it's really easy to grow so many green beans that you can't even deal with them all, which I don't want to grow that many. I just want to grow enough that we can eat them whenever we want to eat them. I don't can them, I don't really preserve them, so I just want enough for eating. And so the succession planting technique I try with these is that I usually come out and I plant 2 rows of beans. Then I come back 2 or 3 weeks later and I plant 2 more rows, so that there's a little bit more of a staggered harvest. So these first 2 rows, they come on, I start harvesting them. Usually you can harvest bush beans for 3 weeks, maybe 4 or 5 weeks if you're lucky. And eventually they stop producing and start to turn yellow and die. And often that's when these are really starting to kick in. Now, I don't do a lot of successions of beans, partly because our summer season is pretty short. So by the time I can plant them, it's probably not until Memorial Day weekend, around that time, maybe a little bit earlier. I do another succession 3 weeks later, and I probably could squeeze in another succession, but then I run out of time and I'm bumping up against the first frost in the fall. But so certainly if there's something that you want to have a little bit more of a harvest season for, but you don't, like maybe you don't love carrots and you don't need to have carrots from July until December, but maybe you'd like to have 2 successions of carrots or 2 successions of beans, and you can just shorten that and squeeze it a little bit closer together. So that's another way you can do it. And then kind of a third way of succession planting is there are some things that do well in spring and then they do well in fall, but they don't really like that hot summer season. So some of the cool weather crops, cilantro would be an example, and lettuce would be a good example. So you can actually plant those things in spring, and then you can plant them again in fall, for fall. So this is a spring planted cilantro. It's a springy picture with some peas. It's probably early June, I would guess, where I have some butterhead lettuce and some cilantro and some peas. And then if you've grown cilantro, you know it very easily goes to flower. These are the cilantro flowers, which I tend to actually leave up because they're a good pollinator attracting flower, and beneficial insects like them. But cilantro doesn't last that long in the spring. Mostly it's because of it bolts because the days are getting longer and also because it's getting hot, but mostly because it's triggered to flower by the lengthening days. So I end up planting cilantro again for the fall. Often I plant it sometime in the second 2 weeks in August. And growing cilantro in the fall is like, it's so much better than the spring. It's almost not worth it to grow cilantro in the spring. In the fall, it lasts so long. And here I'm still, sometimes it's extremely cold hardy, so it can last for a long time uncovered past the first frost in your garden. But then if you have a cold frame or you have a low tunnel, you can really get it to last. So often I'm harvesting it in December. And then I actually found out that if I leave my cold frame and my low tunnel on the bed that has cilantro, it starts to come back this time of year. And so I get a really early spring crop. Eventually it bolts, but it can survive the winter if it's covered. So I planted a lot last fall and it's covered in plastic. So I'm really hoping that it's going to come back and we're going to have tons of cilantro really early. Hopefully in a month from now, I should be harvesting a lot of cilantro. So the best veggies for succession planting to experiment with are on your handout. Beans, we talked about. Beets are very carrots. You could do succession plantings throughout from early spring all the way until about mid to late July. Broccoli, we talked about carrots, cilantro, cucumber, dill, lettuce, radish, salad mix, spinach, and turnips. So we don't have time to go through every single one, but some of them you can do spring and fall. Some of them, like beans, you can do a couple of successions in the summer. And then some things like carrots and beets, you can do successions through a longer part of the season. Okay, so for summer, that's really the main technique. I mean, the great thing about planting early in the spring is that in the summer, you're going to get a lot more food in the early summer. And so by taking care of yourself in early spring, you'll start to have lots of harvest in the summer. And then you can start succession planting so that carries through. So if you have any tips to share how you get more food out of your garden in the summer, feel free to pop it in the chat. It's always fun to hear what other people do. And I'm just going to take a look at the chat, see if there's any questions. Yeah, we got some more questions in. Somebody asked if I plant square foot style. I've never planted that way. I do more in rows, sometimes rows down the length of the bed, sometimes rows across the bed. But it really depends on the vegetable, but mostly row style within beds. And then a common question that people ask me is what I use for mulch. I use hay, either marsh hay or straw on my vegetable beds, and I use wood chips in the aisles. And then somebody asked what the carrot seeds are called. So they're called pellet, like a pellet seeds. And I got those from Johnny's. So Johnny's selected seeds. If you look up carrots, they often have, for a lot of varieties, a pelleted version or a non-pelleted version. And then somebody asked how I fertilize. I use an organic fertilizer every time I plant. And I suggest that all gardeners do that because soil health and soil nutrients are so important to the health and the performance of your garden. I actually have a blog post, a blog article. These are all the common questions that come up that I often write articles about. That is on my website. And I think it's just /organic-fertilizer. And it tells you what to look for in a fertilizer. It gives some suggestions of some different brands that I like. So it's kind of a big topic. So I would suggest if you're interested, you can read the article. And where do I get my seeds from this year? Well, pretty much every year I order from Johnny's and High Mowing. They have really great varieties. They sell to a lot of farmers. So they have very dependable varieties. They often have the latest varieties that are being bred for specific reasons, often bred to combat different diseases and fungal issues. And then I also sometimes I get seeds from Baker Creek, Renee's, Botanical Interests, Seed Savers, but Johnny's and High Mowing are where I get the majority of my seeds from. And someone said the best advice they ever heard about gardening: always plant something new in spaces where you have harvested. She said, if you leave blank space, Mother Nature will fill your space for you. Yes, she will, with weeds. All right. Oh, and Liz found the organic fertilizer. It's so great to have somebody totally on it. So Liz found the link to the organic fertilizer. You can always copy and paste it from chat if you want to look at it later, or just write a note. And then finally, someone asked how I water my garden. I water my garden mostly with a hose, by hand. I don't water a ton. I mulch very heavily, and so if it rains, I don't really water my garden. Your garden needs about a 1 inch of water per week, depending on your soil. If you live in a really sandy area, you need more than that. But if it rains, I don't water. If it doesn't rain an inch, then I water with the hose. But if you mulch really heavily, you shouldn't have to water as much. Okay. All right. So fun to talk about gardening. Oh, and then I have an email list. I'm sure some of you are on it, which is why you're here, because I told you about this class. But if you're not, if you're new to me, Liz has the link that she'll post in chat. You can click on it and put in your email. I send out an email every Sunday with videos and articles and the latest news of what's happening in my garden. And then often share if I have upcoming classes that you can take. So you're welcome to join, and it's easy to unsubscribe at any time. All right. Well, personally, I do not want to talk about fall right now because it's not even spring, but we're going to dive into fall. This is my garden on a fall day. I don't want to think about the end of the garden season. I want to think about the beginning. So fall technique number one, which I've kind of alluded to throughout this class. I showed you a bunch of pictures from my fall garden and my season extension in the beginning of the class. But fall technique number one is to plant a fall garden. I love gardening in the fall, and I think it's a very underrated season. It cools down. Where I live, the mosquitoes leave. We get more rains. Plant growth slows down, so there's not a lot of weeds. A lot of the insects start leaving, the ones that bother our gardens. So I love, love, love having a fall garden, and I love spending time in my garden in the fall. So we're going to go back and use carrots as an example. So these are planted July 22nd, my last succession planting. And at this time, I'm starting to focus on my last succession planting is focused on fall and winter. Okay, I want to have carrots for fall and winter. This photo is from August 22nd. And then October 22nd, I'm harvesting carrots. It's fall. It must be a warm day because I have a short sleeve shirt on. And then November 20th, it frosts. It doesn't matter. Carrots are super cold hardy. Their greens can be affected by the frost, and they'll just bounce back if it warms up. And then you saw this picture before. In December 6th, I am harvesting those carrots that I planted in July for the last time. And they're going to kind of hopefully get me through the winter, which we'll talk about when we talk about the winter section. So this is an example of one thing that you can plant for the fall. But some other things that you can plant, which you saw in a lot of my pictures at the beginning of the class, arugula. If you've struggled with growing arugula in the spring, it's kind of like cilantro. It bolts really quickly. Arugula in the fall is like a whole nother vegetable. It never bolts, super cold hardy. It grows really well, and you can harvest it for quite a long time. Beets and carrots we've talked about, cilantro we talked about. There's tons and tons of greens. Spinach and mustards and specialty Asian greens like tatsoi. This year I actually ordered a whole bunch of different greens, cold hardy greens for fall that I've never grown before. I ordered amaranth and just all kinds of things that looked really interesting. Radishes, especially daikon radishes. I grew a huge bed of daikon radishes this year that it went really well, and they held up really well in the cold weather, and I was harvesting them all the way to December. Salad mix loves the fall weather. Spinach loves the fall weather, and turnips. We're going to deep dive into spinach because it's one of my favorite things to grow in the fall. Really, was like my gateway vegetable into fall gardening. So you saw this picture. This is a Thanksgiving picture. It has a lot of those things that are on the list that really thrive in the fall. So we're going to overwinter spinach. Like I said, this is basically, it was like a mistake, or like I didn't even know what I was doing. And it was what got me first interested in kind of out of season gardening in the fall and the winter and the early spring. So spinach, I usually plant it in where I live in Madison around August, the second or third week in August every year. So I'm planting it August 11th. It's germinating, coming up. This is a picture from September 26th. So by September 26th, I have a pretty nice bed full of spinach I'm starting to harvest. And I'm harvesting all through October. This is Halloween. I'm still harvesting spinach for probably spinach salad for dinner. November 29th. So by then we might, and where I live, we might be getting some hard frosts. It doesn't matter. You can either go out and harvest the spinach when it's frozen and just throw it in a smoothie or a soup or something like that. Or you can wait until a day where it gets above 32 and then it'll defrost and it'll be like fresh spinach, and you just go out and start harvesting it again. So it just depends what you want to use it for. It looks like I'm going out to just grab some for a smoothie, so I don't really care that if it's frozen or not. And then often I'll cover it with a low tunnel. You do not have to ever cover your spinach. For many, many, many years, I never covered it. And I have a bed sitting out there right now that's covered in snow. That's all spinach, and I did not cover it. I just left it uncovered for the winter. But sometimes I put on a low tunnel or I put on a cold frame top, and just to keep it defrosted mostly. And then also it kind of kickstart its growth at the end of winter because it's a little bit warmer in there, but you don't have to. And then December 8th, I'm still harvesting spinach. Sometimes I try to harvest it for Christmas or Christmas Eve if I have enough left. But what often happens is this time of year, there is really no plant growth happening. And so if you heavily harvest all your spinach, it's not really replacing its leaves. And so eventually I get to the point where there's not much to harvest anymore. And so some years at this point, I'll cover the whole thing with hay or straw just to protect the plants from winter winds and winter drying out, desiccation. But sometimes I don't, and I just leave it like that if I don't feel like going out and mulching. This year I just left it. It's mostly been covered in snow, which is kind of like a mulch, but you can just leave it out and it'll survive the winter. And I shared this record-breaking year where I actually harvested spinach already. It would have been I harvested it already if it was this year, but that's not the typical year. But the typical year is by about mid-March, that same spinach that you planted in August, it starts to grow again, and you can start harvesting, which is pretty amazing. And then sometimes it snows in March in Madison, doesn't matter, does not phase the spinach, it melts quickly. And then April 22nd, that bed has really bounced back from the winter, and it's just pumping out more spinach than I can even eat. So usually in Madison, for spring planting, I'm planting my first spring planting right about this time, but I'm still getting spinach from the year before. And then May 17th, I'm still getting spinach from that August planting. It's an absolutely amazing phenomenon. So imagine spinach, your spring planted spinach. So every year I also plant spinach in spring, and it doesn't really last that long because it starts to get hot and then it bolts with the lengthening days. And every year I think it's so not worth it to grow spinach in spring. It's so much better in the fall. And so eventually that previous year's spinach, it does bolt sometime in May. which is why sometimes I plant spring spinach to go past that bolting period. And then I get a few more harvests out of my spring planted spinach. But spinach is an amazing vegetable. It can survive the winter in Wisconsin, which is something I can barely do myself. So if you do nothing else from this class, I highly recommend, if you like growing spinach and you like eating spinach, and if you felt frustrated with it in the spring, one is plant it early, 4 weeks before last frost, but also try planting it in the fall instead. All right. So we've talked about spring, summer, fall. Fall was plant a fall garden. And we just really touched on fall gardening. I actually have, I'll share at the end, I have a free mini course that goes a little bit further into fall gardening and then introduces you to a master class, an online master class that I have that really breaks it all down with calendar templates and how to, if you want to build cold frames and low tunnels and use row cover. If you're really excited about diving into that world, I have a whole class about it with videos from my garden that leads you through the entire process. So it's a little bit of a learning curve to figure out your timing and what you should grow. But once you take a class or once you figure it out on your own, it can be really fun. All right, and then we talked about overwintering spinach, which is super fun. So I'm going to skip over questions until the end because I'm starting to run out of time. I told Liz that I think I'm talking too much in my classes because I keep running up to the hour mark and I'm not done. So she said she wasn't in a big rush, so we might go a couple minutes over. But then if people need to leave, they can leave at the end of the class. And then if there's some more questions, we can stay behind for anybody that has some time to stay, and I can answer the remaining questions. Okay, so winter, I definitely don't want to talk about winter because it's the end, but it is a key to having more food from your garden for more months of the year, especially in cold areas. Now, for most of us, like I said, even in zone 5, even though I can really push my season, for a lot of December, let's say the second half of December, January and February, I'm not going to really be able to harvest from my garden. There's not much happening. I've harvested a lot of the things that aren't super cold hardy. You know, it could get down to 0 degrees, below 0 degrees Fahrenheit in Madison. So there's a lot of things that I can't leave in my garden. There are some things I can leave in the cold frames and the low tunnels, but it's pretty hard without really probably a greenhouse or a heated greenhouse to really garden in the winter. But one thing that I like to do is store as much as possible. And so I'm really into super easy food preserving. I don't do a lot of canning. It's not really my favorite activity. I find it to be a lot of work. And I know a lot of people love canning, and if you do, that's great. But if you're looking for some other options, I am a minimalist. And so I'm always looking for the simplest and most efficient way to do things, and that's including food preserving. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that I preserve food. So this comes from my book, which is called Super Easy Food Preserving. And one technique I talk about is fresh preservation. So vegetables kept in their natural state in a cool, dry place in your house, like your basement, a semi-warm garage, a cold room, or a closet. So anywhere that's not, it's really like the coldest parts of your house, but places that don't freeze. So you don't want to put things in a detached garage that freezes, but if you have a garage that's attached and it's chilly, but it never really freezes, that would be a great place to store things. I have an unfinished basement that's pretty cold in the winter. We don't really use it. We don't go down there really, except for doing the wash and getting all the vegetables that we've stored. I have a closet down there that doesn't have a window, and I store a lot of stuff in there. So it's not really it's not really a root cellar, it's just a cold closet. So winter squash is a really easy thing to store. I still have a whole bunch of winter squash in my closet down the basement. And what I usually do, I actually don't grow a lot of squash because it takes up so much room. I go to the farmer's market in the fall and I take a bunch of crates, and everybody has winter squash. And I buy a bunch of winter squash because the prices are very reasonable. They have lots of different varieties. I look for storage varieties. Butternut squash stores pretty well. There's even some specialty varieties that store even better. And I fill up a couple crates. Usually I get about 12 to 15 different storage squashes, and then I put them in the basement, and then we use them all winter. This weekend, actually, I'm going to make some butternut squash soup with some squash we have down the basement. Onions are another one we've talked about. I told you I have 700 onions right next to me. Plants growing. I still have probably 2 crates of onions down the basement. It's been a cold winter here, so they've stored really well. But they're an pretty easy thing to store if you grow storage onions. That's the trick. But I just have these old bulb crates that I just stack them in my basement in the closet. And then right next to them, you can see there's some cardboard boxes with garlic. And same thing, if you grow the right variety of garlic, a storage variety, it'll store for all winter, really, and into the spring. So there's not a ton of things that you can store fresh, but garlic, onions, potatoes are another thing. Sweet potatoes are easy to store, and winter squash. And then spinach is a little bit of a cheat because we talked about it, and you can just store it fresh in your garden. You don't even have to bring it inside, and it'll be fine. And then drying herbs are pretty good for drying. And then I don't really talk about it in this class, but I do have an herb class where I talk about, I make a lot of herb sauces and I freeze those. That's my favorite way to preserve herbs, but you can also dry them, which is pretty easy. And then the second technique is fridge. So vegetables that can be kept for long periods of time with the aid of refrigeration. Pretty straightforward. We talked a lot about carrots in this class because they're so versatile for so many different reasons. And you can store them. There's that picture again, December 6th. I'm harvesting in the snow. I'm getting all the carrots out of my garden. And then I take off the tops and then I put them in bags. I usually don't wash the soil off. Some people do. You could experiment. But I just stick them in dirty. If they're really wet, I kind of let them dry. I spread them out on newspaper and let them dry a little bit. But then I stick them in plastic bags, and then I just shove all the plastic bags in the bottom of my fridge. So we just used the last bag last week. Actually, we ate that for dinner. We had roasted vegetables for dinner with some rice and some herb sauce. And there were some carrots from last year's garden that my husband dug out, and he said, I'm just going to use these up. So a couple didn't look that great. He just threw them in the freezer for our soup stock, but the rest he roasted. So for fridge, again, it's another small category, but you can do beets the same exact way as you do carrots. Leeks last for a fair amount of time in the fridge, but not quite as long as beets and carrots. Cabbage is more in the leek category. It lasts for a while. And then cucumbers, I used to make refrigerator pickles, which last for a really long time, but now I actually ferment my cucumbers, and they'll last for up to a year in the fridge, fermented, if you don't eat them first. We already ate all ours, they're all gone. There's no way they would last for a year. And then the final category, which is probably the one you're most familiar with, is freezer. So when you're freezing vegetables, it's best to have a chest freezer because it stays at a constant temperature. It's colder than your upstairs freezer that goes with your refrigerator, but you can still do it in your refrigerator freezer. But I have a chest freezer in my basement. We usually freeze it up, fill it all up in the summer and fall, and then hopefully eat it empty by the beginning of the next food preserving season. So I'll just use tomatoes as an example because I think a lot of people in this class said that's one of their favorite things to grow. A lot of people can tomatoes. I don't like to can tomatoes. I just freeze them. I just chop them all up. I don't care about the skins and the seeds. I don't remove any of those. And then I put them in a stainless steel casserole pan that I just got from a restaurant supply store in town. It was $25, not very expensive. And then I put it over 2 burners on the stove and just cook it down for an hour and a half, 2 hours, until it looks kind of saucy. I'm not too picky. I'm just trying to cook a lot of the water off because I can put a lot more tomatoes in the same space if I cook some of the water off. So then I put them in the plastic yogurt containers, put them in the freezer, and then we use them in any recipe that calls for canned whole tomatoes, canned chopped tomatoes, fire roasted tomatoes, any kind of canned tomato product. So I haven't bought canned tomatoes in years, and these taste way better than any canned tomato product you can get in the store. And then if you want to make tomato sauce, you can just put some onions and garlic and olive oil in a pan, dump 1 or 2 of those in, add some spices, and then put it on top of pasta. So really versatile. And then there are a lot of things that you can freeze. Some of them need to be pre-processed, like broccoli needs to be steamed before you freeze it. Other things like peppers, a lot of people said that in this class they like to grow peppers. I freeze peppers raw. I freeze a lot of kale. You can freeze kale raw. That's one of the most popular articles on my site, how to freeze kale. That's really easy. I eat kale all the time from last year. That's frozen in the freezer. I put it in frittatas. We put it in soups. We put it in stir fries. We put it in all kinds of things. You can put it in smoothies. So there's lots of things on this list. And if you want to know more specifically about some of those things, you can check out. I have blog posts about some of them on my site, or you could check out my book. Super easy food preserving. You can get the digital or the print copy. And I actually have also a free mini course on my site that talks about filling your pantry for the winter from your garden. So you can learn a little bit more specifically about some of the things that I do. All right, so we got through spring, summer, fall, winter, all the different seasons. And we covered a lot, right? So there's a lot of things here. What I would suggest that you pick 1 or 2 and pay attention to how you felt during the class. And if something really excited your mind and your inspiration, I would start there. So I'd love to hear in the chat if there's 1 or 2 things that you thought, yeah, I want to try that this year. That sounds like fun. I encourage you to experiment and just not try to take too much on at once. So this year's garden challenge for you is to pick 1 thing and see if you can grow all that you need for the entire year, that you never buy it from the farmer's market or the grocery store. You're totally self-sufficient in 1 thing. And there's lots of things that you could pick. Somebody said herbs, maybe you decide herbs. I do mint. I dry a lot of mint because I drink mint tea every day. So maybe you could dry mint so that you never have to buy mint tea. Garlic is a pretty easy thing to grow and store. Maybe you eat a lot of pesto. And so you're just going to make all the pesto you need for the whole year. We talked about tomatoes. You're not going to buy any canned tomato products. So I think it's a fun challenge to try to be, I think, just a good exercise in self-sufficiency and a challenge to yourself. Is there 1 thing that you can just provide everything you need for the whole year? So if there's something that popped into your head, feel free to put it in the chat, 1 thing that you think that you could provide yourself and your household for the whole year. It's a fun challenge. So report back sometime at the end of the season. Send me an email or a message and tell me what you decided to do. So my website is creativevegetablegardener.com. You can find a lot of the things that I talked about. You can find my books, digital or print. We actually talked about both of them in this class, which doesn't always happen. And then I have a bunch of free mini courses and more coming there. And you can find them at creativevegetablegardener.com/freebies. There's one about growing herbs, one about filling your pantry for the winter, and one about extending the season. So there'll be a few more added this year as well, if you check back on that page. All right. Thank you for coming. I hope this inspired you to try to figure out how you can get more months of food out of your garden. I hope it gave you some techniques to make that happen. And feel free, if you have to leave, go for it. If you're on my email list on Sunday, I have a bunch more classes coming up this month and even into April. I have 7 different classes that I teach, so you can catch some of the other ones. And I'll answer some of the last questions that came in if you want to stick around and listen. So thanks for coming, everyone. Let's see. So somebody wanted to know if it's hard to grow Brussels sprouts. I think it is, personally. They have a lot of high nutrient needs, so you want to make sure you have some really healthy soil. One of the things that happens is you plant them in April and they're not really ready until September, October, even November. So they do take up a lot of space in the garden for a long time, but I still grow a few. I think they're fun to grow, but I think they can be challenging. And then somebody said, what varieties are storage? You really have to read the seed catalogs, read about the different varieties. If you're thinking that you want to store certain things, then you really want to read the descriptions and look. So if you're looking at onions in the seed catalog, you want to look for things, the varieties that say are great for storage. So that's one way to figure it out. So someone asks, what do I mean by growing storage onions? You need to pick a variety that's good for storage. So this is the benefit of starting your own seeds. You can pick the varieties that serve your individual situation. But again, if you read through my blog post about growing onions, it explains everything about varieties and sets versus plants versus starting your own seeds. It's very comprehensive. So if you're curious about growing onions better, check out that post. It's /growing-onions. And you can, I always search for things on my own site by typing in Google, create a vegetable gardener growing onions, and then the blog post pops up. So you can always do that too. So someone asked if I offer a class on storage. My book talks a little bit about storage, and then I have an online class that talks about that as well. But I don't talk about just storage. I talk about lots of different things for food preserving. And then somebody asked my favorite types of spinach to grow. There's a lot of different varieties. I would say I don't grow Bloomsdale, which is the most common, because I find that it bolts really quickly in the spring. So I showed you I had giant winter spinach, or yeah, giant winter is one that I always grow. Let's see, there's Escalade, I think I grew last year. I buy most of my spinach from either High Mowing or Johnny's. And I usually look for bolt resistant ones that are cold hardy. And so I would recommend just reading over the descriptions in those two seed companies. And those are some of my favorites. And how do I handle rabbits? I have a fence around my front yard garden, a 2-foot fence, so the rabbits cannot get in. On my side yard garden, we don't have a fence, but it's a pretty well-traveled area, and I don't often see rabbits there, but I make sure I don't plant some of the things that rabbits like in that area that doesn't have a fence. I also use a lot of row cover in the spring to protect young plants. So that would be one thing. You can, I don't know if I have a blog post about row cover, but that's a great tool for the spring that we don't have a ton of time to go into right now, but you can read about row cover a little bit. And then somebody asked if I have any tips for growing strawberries. I don't grow strawberries in my garden. Honestly, in Wisconsin, the strawberry harvesting season is only 3 weeks long, and strawberries stay in that space in your garden for the entire year. So I don't actually think they're worth it. In my garden, for only 3 weeks of harvest, they take up all that space for the whole year. I usually just go pick strawberries. But tips for growing strawberries is basically they really stop producing after a few years. So you have to be constantly starting new beds with runners. So if you have an old strawberry bed, you probably need to refresh it. So sometimes what people do is they have 2 or 3 strawberry beds and they're rotating through. So they have a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old strawberry bed, and then they rip out that 3-year-old and then replant it. So you're always having to kind of restart it from the runners. That's one of the challenging things about strawberries. So somebody asked, how many minutes or hours do I spend in the garden a day? So I have never kept track, because for me, it's such a meaningful part of my life and my mental health and my emotional health that I don't care how much time I spend, because it's such an important part of my life. I've thought about, like, I should really figure out how much time I spend and then weigh all my produce and figure out how much money in produce I'm generating. And I thought, no, I don't want to do all that. I'm going to garden regardless, because I love it so much. So I think for me, gardening, it really depends on the time of year. So the spring can be really busy because I'm getting the garden prepared, I'm planting lots of seeds and plants. And then there's kind of a dead time, or let's not say a dead time, a slow time after the end of May through June. I feel like you're kind of just waiting for things to grow. I'm doing a little bit of harvesting. And then really July, I don't feel like is super busy, but then when things really, the harvest really starts coming in, August, September can be kind of busy because you're trying to deal with the harvest. August, I'm planting all my fall crops, but then the fall, it's not as busy because things are kind of slowing down. So I think it has an ebb and a flow to it. There are days that I don't go into my garden. I try to go in at least for a couple of minutes every day. And there's some days that I spend 2 hours. So it really, I think you can spend as much time as you want in your garden. And I have a big garden, so I definitely spend more time than someone with a small garden. Okay, I think that's it. One more. So someone asked if I can share the link for my presentation slides. I don't share my slides for my presentation, just because then I don't have control over what happens to them. So, but I'll be giving this class again this month, so you can come again if you want to check out the slides again. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your questions and participating in the chat. It was really fun to at least get to chat with you, even though we can't see each other in person. So happy almost spring, and I wish you a wonderful and productive and beautiful season in your garden. Have a good night.